Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to look at the use of software auto forms by adding conditional controls. In this project, we have created two generic applications. The purpose of these applications is to allow a user to enter data into a form. However, the controls that exist within this form are configured from within an external file. The first of the two applications is Form Runner. When Form Runner is executed, it displays a list of forms the user can interact with. The details of these forms are held in configuration files. If we go into the Forms folder and into the Configs folder, we will see that there are three CSV files: TestDemo, TestDemo2, and TestDemo3. If we open up TestDemo3, we will see a list of controls that are to appear on this particular form. The title gives us the title of the form and its width and height, and the fact that it's centered on the screen. A number of other objects are actually supported, for example buttons, labels, texts, and so on. For each of these objects, the X and Y coordinates are specified, the width and the height of the object, and the unique identifier. There are additional columns to control other aspects of these objects, including a field name, which is used to specify which of the fields are output to an external file when the user clicks the Submit button. Today we're going to be adding two new columns to this configuration file. The purpose of these two columns is to mark which fields are conditional. When you're designing forms, there may be times in your form when you do not want some fields to appear until something else has occurred. For example, when the user clicks on a checkbox, you wish another label and text box to appear to elicit more information from the user. Up until the clicking of that checkbox, these two objects are invisible and non-accessible by the user. So that's our task for today, to configure the application to allow these to exist in the configuration file. So let's have a look at the code. The application we're going to make changes to is the autoform.bas file. Before we go ahead and make changes to the functionality of this application to support these new pieces of functionality, there's one little feature I want to fix. Currently, if the application runs and the user picks one of the forms, if the output for that form does not exist, the application has issues. Normally, for the very first time the application runs, you may not actually have an output file. So we need to amend our pbmain function to cater for that. And when no output file has been created, it has the job of creating the output file. So if we have a look at the pbmain function. In this pbmain function, this is where the configuration file is loaded up. The configuration file is loaded into a global array, and then we populate the form data array based on the information held within that configuration file. However, if the output file does not exist, the populate the form array will return the value false, and there is nothing in code here to handle that condition. So we're going to create a new function called createOutputFormData. This will have the task of creating the headers for the output file. So here is a new function, createOutputFormData, which takes no parameters. This will create a blank output form, containing only the headers. The first part of the code is to get the output file name. We already have a function which returns this called returnSaveFileValue. So we're making use of that function to return and populate the output variable. And we also have a function which returns all the column names. So we're making use of that one as well, to populate the headers variable. these column names do include the very first column, which is displayed to the user. This is the ID column containing the form number. We don't need this in our output file. Therefore, our next task is to trim that off. So we're redimensioning the form data array, which is global, to contain two rows, a 0 row, which are the headers, and a first row, which is blank. And we're populating the 0 row with the result of the end range parse. This is taking all the information in the headers from the second element onwards. Having populated this array, we're using the existing function in our common file handling routines to dump the array to disk. So in order to prove this change is functional, we'll need to run the application with a new config file. So we're creating a new file called testdemo4, again as a CSV file. And in this CSV file, we're going to add two new columns. We're going to add a column called conditional and a column called selection. The purpose of these will become apparent very soon. So if we create a few objects on this just to test it out. So with this in place, we should now be able to test it. If we look inside the forms data folder, we will see the userdata.csv file. The CSV file that will be created in here when we run the application is configured in our config file, and it's going to be called leavedata.csv. As we can see, this does not currently exist as an output file. If we run our application now, we get the form displayed on the screen with its single editable field. If we exit the application and have a look back in our forms data folder, we will see we now have a leavedata.csv, which has a single name field in it, which is what is configured in the configuration file. So we have successfully created an output file where one did not exist before. So we're now going to create a few more objects within our configuration file. If we save these additional configuration items, and we go back and run the application once more, we'll see we're getting now more objects on the screen. We have a special leave type, which is going to be a drop-down list. If we look at our configuration file, we can see the drop-down list is being populated from a text file called leavetype.txt. And our leavetype.txt has a short list of leave types. We now have a list of leave types appearing in the drop-down list. What we want the application to do now is that when one specific item on this list is picked, for example, jury duty, we want two additional objects to appear on the screen, one being a label and one being an additional text box. When any other item is picked from this drop-down list, these two new objects are to remain invisible. So how can we do that in the code? First of all, in the config file, we're going to add some more objects. And the two new objects we're going to add are a label to say court ref and a text field to allow the user to enter a reference value. So if we run the application as it stands, we will see that this field appears automatically. Now, as nothing has been selected for the leave type yet, we want the court reference label and text box to be invisible until such times as a user clicks jury duty. So let's go and make some changes in the code to make this invisible. We have two scenarios to look at here. The first scenario is when the form first loads and the user has selected nothing. The second scenario is where the user is actually interacting with the form. So let's first do the initial loading of the form. This takes place in the populate form function. In this function, we go through all the entries that came from the config file, currently loaded into the global configuration array. After all of these objects have been created, we want to check our configuration array to see if any of the objects are dependent on any other object. So at the end of the function, before we set focus to the start of the form, we're going to call a new function. And we'll call that function hideObjects. This is the skeleton of our new function. As before, we need to step through each row in the configuration file. So let's have a quick look at the configuration file itself. You will see in here, these are the two new entries, one label and one text. These have their own unique identifier numbers. And we're now using these two new columns we added to our config file, conditional and selection. This is to indicate that both of these objects are dependent on object 2005, which in this case is the drop-down list. And the selection column holds the value we're searching for. If the value in the drop-down list is jury duty, then these two objects will become visible. In all other scenarios, these objects should be invisible. So our first task is to look through here to find those objects which have a conditional entry. And we will then check the default values to see if that matches. So if that matches that, then the object should be visible. Otherwise, it should be made invisible. So we will first create some local variables to allow us to do this. And then next, it will be a standard for next loop. We're first checking to see whether the entry in the configuration array is blank. If that is so, then we iterate to the next row. We're then populating the data variable with the value in the row. Next, we need to pick up 3 pieces of key information. The reference ID, which is the handle of the control, the conditional control value, and the selection value. Here we're referring to constants. These constants we have not yet created, so we'll double back in a moment and create them at the beginning of the code, in the enumeration section. If the conditional control is actually a number greater than 0, then this object is conditionally visible. We can check the value of the default selected by using the existing function to return the field value from the defaults column. And if these two values do not match, if the selection doesn't match the default selection, then we hide the control. So in the code previous, we created the object, and here we decide whether the object is to be hidden or not. So let's now go back to the beginning of the code and create these two new constants. So there we have the ref conditional and ref selection added to the list of enumerations. So this logic is followed for each entry in the configuration file. In our configuration file, I've set the drop-down list to have no default. So if we run our application now, we should see that the two extra fields are initially invisible. So the first scenario we have now catered for. We now have to cater for when a user makes a change. So for example, if the user selects jury duty, we want these two fields to appear. So there needs to be some handling of the changes to this drop-down list. And this would take place in the run control process, our equivalent of an event handler. So if we have a look at the run control process, I'm going to create two new local variables, one called strdata and one called longResult. In this section of the code, we handle each of the types of object on which some event has occurred. So in this section of code, we have at the moment only events occurring to buttons: the save button and the exit button. So we'll need to add 3 new types of object. First of all, drop-down list. If the user picks from the drop-down list and picks jury duty, we want the objects to be visible. Otherwise, if they pick anything else, we want the 2 new objects to disappear. We'll also need to put an event in for a text box and also for the checkbox. We'll handle the drop-down list first of all. Our drop-down lists in this application are for single selects only, as we want to take the value the user's picked and to push it out to the output file. So we're trapping the button clicked message, and we know at this point that the user has made some selection. So as these are single select, we know we can use the control get text command to pull back from the control the value and put it into the data variable. So once we've done that, we need to work out whether there's a dependent control. Has the user changed something that needs to make something invisible or visible? So we're going to create a new function to work out if this object has a dependent control. And this new function can be used for each of the other object types we want to do events on. So we're passing two parameters to this new function, the first being the control handle. This is a control handle of the object that the user has actually clicked on, and the str data, the second variable, is the value we've taken out of that object. So let's now create this new function as dependent control. So here's the skeleton of our new control. We're using 4 local variables here to keep track of what we're doing within the configuration file, as again, this will be another for next loop. As before, we want to pick up from our configuration file some key pieces of information, the reference ID, the conditional value, and the object. If we find a match, we can then pick up the selection from the selection column. And if that matches the data being passed in for this function, then we can show the control on screen by using the control normalize command. And then we'll return the value true. Otherwise, we will hide the control using the control hide command. Since the user may move around the form quite dynamically, it may well have been populated in a previous selection. So if the form is to hide the control, we'll also blank out the value in the control. Now we know there are going to be 3 different types of control here. There could well be a text control, a checkbox, or a drop-down list. And there'll need to be different commands to blank out each of those. So we're going to create a common function to blank a control. So we'll call this new function blank control, giving it 3 variables: the handle of the dialog, the handle of the object, and the type of the object. Is it a text box? Is it a drop-down list? Or is it a checkbox or tick box? And this function is going to be very straightforward indeed. We're doing a select case statement on the type of object. If for text, we're doing a control set text command, and for the tick box, we're doing a control set check command. And for the drop-down list, we're doing a combo unselect. If we try running our application once more. Initially, the new objects are invisible. If we pick jury duty, then the 2 objects have now appeared and can be populated. If we change our mind and go back and pick a different value, they will disappear again, and if we go back to jury duty, they will reappear, but there is no data within the field, so the data we keyed in has been automatically wiped. So we've succeeded in allowing our 2 new objects to be controlled by a parent control. The value in that parent control defines whether the objects are visible to the user or not. So let's go back to our config file. I'm going to add some more objects to our config file. I'm going to do a checkbox or a tick box to mark whether the user is working at home or not. And then an additional text box to allow the user, when that is ticked, to enter a number of hours per day. So if we save that now, if we have a look at our config file now, we'll see we have a number of new objects. We have a label saying working at home and a tick box. Underneath that, we have a label saying enter hours per day and another text box, allowing the user to enter daily hours. These daily hours entries have a conditional of 2013, which is the working at home tick box. So as before, we want these extra fields only to appear when the tick box has been ticked. So let's go back to the code. We made a change for the drop-down list in the run control process, our equivalent of a callback function. So let's go back in there and put in some additional code to handle these 2 new objects. As we've got an entry for the drop-down list, we need one for the text box. This time we're looking for the enChange event, in which case we're picking up the value in our text box and putting it into the data variable, and we're calling the function we created earlier as dependent control, passing it the same two parameters. And we've created a new section for tick boxes. As these are basically buttons, we're using the bn clicked event. We're using control get check to get their value, and we're calling again the has dependent control. So if we try running the application again, we will see all our fields are now displaying on screen. Jury duty is already picked because that's form number 1. So if we select a different value, it will disappear. And if we tick on our working at home, we will get the entry of hours per day. If that is unticked, the value will disappear. And as before, if we put an entry in place, if we untick it and then tick it again, the entry is blank. There is one additional change we need to make to our application to hide these conditional objects, and that is in the reset form function. When the user enters some values, and saves them, is that the reset form function will reset the form completely. So as working at home is not ticked, the enter hours per day label and text box should disappear. So let's go to the reset form function and put a call in to our function to hide objects. So the change we'll have to make will be right at the very end of this function, after the loop has completed. And there is our hide objects function. So to finish off our testing, I've amended the default for the leave type to be holiday. So when the form initially loads, the two fields for jury duty should be hidden. So let's try running the application and see if that tests out. So there is our application now loaded. We have holiday pre-selected. We can put an entry in. And we can click OK. So that should show at the top of our form without any of the new fields being populated. We can now put a new entry in. We will now pick jury duty, should make our new fields appear. We can put our date in place. And we can mark it working from home for 1 hour per day. And we can hit the OK button. This should now have populated home working and 1 for daily hours. So if we exit out of that and have a look at our output file. And in our data folder, we now have a leavedata.csv, and it is now showing home working 1 and data hours 1. 1 in home working, which is a checkbox, indicates that this has been ticked. So what we've achieved today is we have taken our application and we have added conditional controls. These are controls that only appear when other selections have already been made. And when those other selections are unselected, our extra controls will become invisible to the user, giving us more flexibility of what we can actually do on forms. Hopefully you'll find this code useful in your applications, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.